So last week we talked about speed and impact, and one of the things that we talked about was active learning and how to incorporate that into your classroom. So we're going to go a little deeper into strategies for active learning. So one of mine and Bruce's favorite quotes is from Barack Obama, where it says, "Change will not come if we wait for some other person or some other time. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the change that we seek." And so when you are thinking about your courses and how you want to design them, you have to be the change that you seek. So all of our information is based in cognitive neuroscience and also learning science. And cognitive neuroscience tells us that adult learners can only listen to a lecture for about 15 minutes. This is limited by two factors: your working memory, so the memory that's putting things away for you, and then interference, so anything that interferes with you being able to understand or to be able to focus. So if new ideas come at us faster than we can process them, then we can't retain them. And it's very similar to, if you've ever seen I Love Lucy, the candy that's coming down the conveyor belt. At first, it's real easy, but if you go too fast or there's too much, then you start to lose it and those candies slip by you. And you can think of those candies as your content. So if you're pushing it too fast, or if there's too much of it, then your students can't keep all of the candies on the conveyor belt. Now, faculty have the best of intentions when you plan your lectures. You have a great deal of knowledge that you want to share, but we have to understand that our students can only cognitively focus for about 15 minutes before they need what's called a brain break. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't work very well if we lecture for 50 minutes. The more time that we lecture, the more cognitive impediments our students will have. So if we can't use every minute of class for lecture, what do we do with those minutes in class? So there's lots of different options. So you should consider your instruction differently. A lot of times we think of instruction as content focused, and we should work towards becoming more student-centered. So we need to break up the flow of instruction. So instead of lecturing for 50 minutes straight, you need to give your students something to break up that lecture. It's uncomfortable for us to think about stepping away and giving up a little bit of control, but your students will retain more and they will be more engaged in your class if you do this. So let's say you have a PowerPoint that's going to take up all 60 minutes, 55 minutes of your class time. You want to try a new active learning thing in your class, but you don't have time to do this if your lecture is going to take all 60 minutes. So there's two options. You can either upload your PowerPoint to the LMS and let your students finish the slides on their own after class, or you can flip your instruction. Now, flipping your instruction allows you to make sure that the students are still getting the content, but they're responsible for getting the content. You provide them the lecture in advance and make sure that they're prepared for your class period so that you can go deeper into the content. So finding a new rhythm is not easy. Let's say our course meets twice a week for 75 minutes each time. If we know that our students can only pay attention for 15 minutes, you can't lecture for all 75 minutes and expect your students to retain all that information. So what you can do is plan breaks for active learning. So you lecture for 10 minutes and then you have an active learning break. Lecture for 10 minutes, have an active learning break. Well, what does that look like? What do these active learning breaks look like? Well, they can take many different forms. So have you ever used a clicker in class? Those are kind of outdated, but I still know some colleges and universities who use them. And if you can get a hold of them, they're a great way to engage your students during your lecture. The same thing can be achieved through instant polling. And you can do this through Mentimeter, Slido, Poll Everywhere. But make sure that if you're starting this out and you haven't done this before, that you give your students time to download the app and to sign up or log in so that they won't be rushed and you won't feel rushed. So it also allows our students who are a little more shy or reserved and don't like to speak out during class to still get their points across and still contribute to the class in a significant way. Make sure that the first time you use the app, you allot time for students to download the app and then plan breaks into your lecture so that you can use the app so that the students see that it is incorporated, and it also gives them that brain break that they need to be able to reset their focus. The on-the-spot information that you're getting, you can use to be able to reteach things that your students didn't get the first time, or be able to provide that on-the-spot, just-in-time learning that is really student-centered. There's many advantages to instant polling. If they're going to be on their smartphones anyways, it gives a good use for that smartphone. It encourages all your students to participate. It's inclusive. It's a great way to prevent exclusion of certain groups. And if you project those responses, then everyone can see their results and see how their answer compares to everyone else. If it's a more subjective question, then they can see kind of where their peers fall. And if it's a more objective question, they can see if they got it right or wrong and what they might need to study when they go back to do their studying later. Another way to gather immediate feedback and to incorporate an active learning strategy is something called an exit slip. So you ask 1 or 2 short questions to your students, and they can answer alone or in a group. It doesn't matter. You usually only base the grade on completion, but it helps you to understand if they got the main points from the lecture. So one way to do that is to take what your objectives were for that day and turn them into a question to see if your students actually met those objectives. There's another thing called a minute paper, and you can incorporate these either at the beginning or either in the middle or at the end of your class, and it asks students meaningful questions like, what are the 2 most significant ideas you learned today? What questions do you still have? And these short minute papers allow you to be able to find out what your students know and what they still have questions about so that you can address those questions in the next lecture, or you can put up a new resource that will help your students. Turn and talk is a way to break up your lecture. It allows your students to collaborate, and we know that peer-to-peer collaboration increases retention and it increases engagement. So if you have a topic that you are discussing in your lecture, you can interject a question where they have to turn and talk to their neighbor. In biology class, the question could have been something like, what could we do to prevent ocean acidification? And so their students would turn and talk to each other, and then you ask somebody from each group what solutions they came up with. And this allows for peer-to-peer collaboration and also for new ideas to be shared. So when your questions don't have a clear-cut answer, you could use something called think, pair, share. So what happens in this mode of active learning is that you give your students a question, you allow them a certain amount of time to think about it and write down their ideas, then they pair up with somebody and they share their ideas, and then they pair up with another set of partners to share their ideas with those sets of partners. This allows, again, for that peer-to-peer collaboration, but it also allows those students who need a second before they can give an answer to be able to formulate the answer to your question before they pair and share. Think, pair, share is a little more time consuming than turn and talk because you are going to have that double share, but it does allow for more unique perspectives to be shared among the classroom. One of my favorite active learning strategies is both Jigsaw and case study. In Jigsaw, this is a great way to break up large blocks of reading so that your students don't feel overwhelmed. One way to do this, and one way that I did this, is each chapter had a different section. So I would assign each person in a group a section. They'll read their section and become an expert on it, and then they teach the other people in the group their section. This allows for the students to collaborate. It reduces the amount of reading that they have to do, but also allows them to still get that content. And we know that teaching is the highest form of learning. And so if they're having to do this teaching, then they're becoming even more, if they're having to do this teaching, then it becomes even more retained in their brains of what it is that they were studying in the first place. The length of this activity will depend on how many people you have, what content you assign, but it's very valuable. The first time that you do it, it's going to look really messy. Your students are going to be a little bit confused, so make sure that you model that behavior and explain to them either through a video or through actually doing it with them the first time what this jigsaw looks like. I love to use case studies to make my subject matter applicable. You can find a case study in almost any of your different disciplines. We have tons of books in the library about different case studies, and we can even help you locate those. I sent out a Tuesday teaching tip in August about case studies. So if you need help with case studies, just let me know. There are also study groups and discussion groups. Study groups and discussion groups can either be done in class or outside of class, but it's another active learning strategy to help with that peer-to-peer collaboration. And it also helps with that retention and that engagement. So they can interact with the course content in a smaller setting. If you want to assign your jigsaw groups where they have to discuss their jigsaw outside of class, you can do that. I used to do it inside class so that I could walk around and make sure that they were getting all the major points that they needed to get. It took about 15 minutes, but if you don't want to use 15 minutes in your class time to do that, you can assign the jigsaw and have them do the discussion groups outside of class. Groups that meet during class time can be facilitated by yourself or by a peer mentor, but I like to do it myself just because it helps you to make sure that your students are getting the things out of the content that you need them to. So sometimes space can be at a premium, especially if you're teaching a large class. It can be hard to break up your discussion and study groups in class time. But if you can't do that, you can always have them meet outside of class. And in the library, we have plenty of rooms. We have group study rooms, we have the fishbowl, we have the student lounges, we have the Richards Media Lab. On the first floor, there's plenty of collaboration spaces where your students can meet together. So if you're new to active learning, we always say to start small. The best advice we can give you is to just insert one active learning strategy. Start with one polling question, or plan a think, pair, share, or find one point in the term that you can do a jigsaw. You don't have to put everything in the kitchen sink in all at once, but you will see a real turnaround in engagement if you start to regularly incorporate these active learning strategies. Or you can go big, and we're happy to help with that. You can do problem-based or project-based learnings. These are the big active learning engagement strategies, and they are referred to as PBL. So in the traditional lecture-based classroom, the emphasis is on direct instruction, but in PBL, it's about students finding that information for themselves and driving themselves based on inquiry. So lectures can still be part of the overall course, but generally they're shorter and less frequent, and it focuses on providing the most essential knowledge to engage your students in their task. There's no longer a sage on the stage. There's a sage who's walking around and facilitating discussions and helping students to learn through inquiry. So when you're doing these problem-based or project-based learning, you need to choose the right task. So give them something that's going to be open-ended with lots of different solutions. It's loosely structured so that they can find their own paths. Like, here's what I want at the end, but how you get there is your own method. Base it on a real-world application. So if I was doing one for biology, we might have a terrarium that we start out with what things are going to be needed, but at the end, I want a fully functional terrarium. You're also going to Connect it to social context or the potential to make a genuine difference in the world, because students really do want to make a difference in their communities. And it should be complex enough that one person can't do it alone. So plan your initial presentation carefully so that you can make sure that you spark their interest, but also so that you can give them enough information and enough expectations that they will be able to understand what you want at the end. So when you're doing these project-based learning or problem-based learning classes, you want to make sure that you create groups and monitor them. So you can do it randomly selecting, you can do it where they choose their own groups, or you can pair together your higher level students with your lower level students so that you have a more even pairing so that the higher level students can bring up the lower level students. And our lower level students, just because they're not performing at the same level as the higher level students, doesn't mean that they don't have a unique perspective to bring. While the project is underway, you can keep tabs on them with peer grading rubrics, making sure that they have certain things that are due at certain times so that we're keeping that project on task. You want to communicate your expectations very carefully. You want to make sure that they know what you want them to do and how you want them to do it when they're in class and when they're working independently outside of class. Emphasize that active participation and reinforce consequences for not upholding your responsibility within the groups. That's where those grading rubrics, those group or peer rubrics can come into play. And establish a series of check-ins. If you give them this project and say it's not due until the end of the semester, but you don't have any check-ins along the way, they're all going to wait until the very last week of the semester to get that done. Or in general, most of them will. And so by having these check-ins, you can make sure that they don't get too far behind. Set your grading requirements at the beginning and make sure that you clearly communicate those to your students. Be very specific about what a successful project looks like and explain everything that they need to have all the way along the way and at the very end. So in an online course that Bruce designed, he taught students using a PBL, and he gave them a case study about food insecurity. And then they had to use design thinking to design a solution for food insecurity in their communities. So they had weekly project journals, they had a design solution, they had to give a video presentation, they had to do peer critiques, they had to do a teammate participation survey, and then a reflective essay. And so all of those things led to them being able to come up with a successful project. There were places to check in along the way. That's that weekly project journal. And then they had those deliverables at the end. This is an example of that confidential survey. If you average them all together, even if there's a really high grade and a really low grade, those will average together to give a real picture of what the students' participation was in the actual group. The biggest challenge to PBLs is that faculty aren't always used to taking their hands off the wheel. I'm a super control freak and I hate giving up control, but allowing your students to have that control really empowers them to find solutions and to be able to do that critical thinking that we really want them to do. And so listen far more than you talk. So when you're supervising those student groups, and you're hearing what they're saying, make sure that you're listening to what they're saying and then asking questions instead of giving direction. Because using that Socratic method that, well, I don't know, what do you think? Or what do you think the next step should be? That really gives students a chance to engage their critical thinking. Start where you are. Active learning strategies can be hard if you're not used to them. But when you begin with that few turn and talk or think pair shares or that instant polling, you can start to see how engaged your students are becoming and how much more they're retaining. And so start where you are and build. I hope that you've enjoyed today's lecture. And if you have any questions, like always, just let us know. You can call, you can text, you can come by. I can come by, whatever you need. We look forward to seeing you at the next seminar.